They say modern life is hard. But most of us have never had to wake up wondering whether we'd eat that day. We've never had to chew bread laced with stone grit or drink ale because water could kill us. We complain about slow Wi-Fi, noisy neighbors, or long shifts, but the reality is, we are the softest humans who have ever lived. And we owe that softness to the brutal, backbreaking, often horrifying lives of those who came before us. In medieval Europe, from roughly the 5th to the 15th century, most people lived hard, dangerous lives marked by scarcity, disease, superstition, and filth. What we take for granted today, clean food, safe drinking water, privacy, medicine, was either a luxury or a fantasy for them. And if you think you could have handled it better, you might want to hear what their daily existence was really like. Let's begin where every day does, with food. Forget the feasts shown in movies, with overflowing tables and roasted boar. That was the rare privilege of nobles. For common people, who made up over 90% of the population, meals were monotonous, nutrient-poor, and sometimes downright dangerous. The staple of most diets was pottage, a kind of vegetable stew that varied depending on what was available: leeks, onions, garlic, cabbages, or turnips. Whatever grew in the garden or was foraged in nearby woods. Grain might be added if there was any to spare. The pottage pot often sat over the fire for days, with ingredients added as they came, the older contents never fully removed. It wasn't uncommon for bits of ash, insects, or mold to make their way in. No one expected it to be clean. No one expected it to taste good. It was simply calories. And in a world of physical labor and constant hunger, that was enough. Bread was another essential, but not the fluffy, soft bread we know today. Most bread was coarse, dense, and often sour. It was made from rye or barley rather than wheat, which was expensive. The grain was ground with heavy stone mills, and over time, fragments of stone ended up in the flour. That meant every bite was laced with tiny rock particles. Chewing wore down teeth to stumps. Dental decay wasn't caused by sugar, but by eating sandpaper with every meal. Even worse, rye, a common grain for the poor, was prone to developing ergot, a toxic fungus. Ergot poisoning could cause hallucinations, convulsions, the sensation of burning limbs, and death. In some regions, entire villages were affected. People would scream, convulse, accuse neighbors of witchcraft. Some historians suggest that ergot poisoning played a role in the rise of mass hysteria and even early witch trials. But no one knew it was a fungus. They thought it was punishment. A curse. Divine wrath. When in reality, the baker just didn't clean his grain. For the average person, meat was rare. Most of it was reserved for the rich, who had hunting rights and access to livestock. Peasants might occasionally eat pork, usually in the form of salted fat or preserved scraps, or catch the odd rabbit or chicken if they were lucky. But hunting game was strictly regulated. In many areas, it was illegal for commoners to hunt deer, boar, or other animals designated as the king's game. Being caught poaching could lead to brutal punishment, mutilation, or worse. When meat did make it to the table, it often wasn't fresh. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly. The wealthy used spices imported at great cost to disguise the smell. The poor couldn't afford spices, so they simply ate it and hoped not to get sick. Mold was scraped off. Rotten bits were cooked longer. The line between food and poison was always thin. Fish was more common, especially on fasting days, which were frequent, sometimes over 150 per year. The church dictated that on these days, meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. That meant fish, salted, dried, smoked, or pickled, became the primary protein. For coastal regions, that was manageable. For inland villages, fish arrived weeks or even months after it was caught, preserved beyond recognition. The taste and smell were less than ideal. But when the priest said no meat, people obeyed. Most people didn't have a varied diet. They ate what grew nearby. Fresh produce was seasonal. Milk could spoil in hours. Cheese was valuable but not always available. And sugar. That was for the elite, imported from distant lands, carefully rationed, and used like medicine or gold. Water was another problem entirely. Today, we turn a tap and expect it to be safe. In the medieval world, water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste. Wells were shallow. Streams ran through villages where people bathed, dumped chamber pots, and slaughtered livestock. Drinking water from the wrong source could give you dysentery, typhoid, or parasites. The solution? Ale. Everyone, men, women, and children, drank ale. But not the high-proof alcoholic brews we imagine. This was small ale, a weak, low-alcohol version that could be consumed all day. It was boiled during brewing, which killed harmful bacteria, making it safer than water. One study estimates that the average peasant consumed up to 8 pints a day. Children as young as 5 had ale with every meal. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. Clean water was so rare that even the church sometimes sanctioned beer for monks during fasts. Wine was another alternative, though it was more common in southern Europe and usually reserved for the wealthy or clergy. Vinegar and sour drinks were sometimes used to disinfect questionable water, but mostly, people relied on weak beer. It kept them hydrated, and more importantly, it didn't kill them. If all of this sounds grim, it only gets worse. Because once the food and drink were consumed, they had to come out again, and that was an entirely new horror. There were no bathrooms. No toilets. Most people relieved themselves in chamber pots, small ceramic or wooden bowls kept under beds or in corners of the house. Once full, they were dumped, often into the street, sometimes out the window. In cities like London or Paris, this became such a problem that laws were passed forbidding waste dumping during daylight hours. In some places, people would shout "Garde-le" before tossing the contents, as a warning to anyone walking below. But waste didn't just vanish. Streets were filthy. Cesspits overflowed. Animals roamed freely, adding their own contributions. The stench of a medieval town was legendary. One writer described the River Thames as a monster of stink, choked with waste, rotting corpses, and industrial runoff. In castles, things were slightly more advanced. The garderobe was a kind of medieval toilet, a stone seat over a chute that dropped waste down the outer wall. At Dover Castle, one chute dropped over 70 feet. Kings and queens may have had thrones, but their toilets were holes with a breeze. Public sanitation was rare. A few towns had communal privies or latrines built over rivers. But most people made do with the outdoors, or with designated filth areas. In urban centers, waste collectors known as gong farmers worked at night, shoveling human excrement out of cesspits and hauling it outside the city walls. The job paid well, up to 4 times the average laborer's wage, but was so foul that gong farmers weren't allowed to work during the day or mingle with the public. Toilet paper did not exist. People wiped with moss, straw, leaves, or, in many regions, their left hand, hence the cultural importance of keeping that hand unclean. The wealthy used scraps of cloth, wool, or hemp, but these were reused and rarely washed. The Romans had once used sponge sticks soaked in vinegar, but that knowledge had largely disappeared by the medieval period. Bathing was rare. Entire winters might pass without a single wash. In some cultures, public bathhouses existed, remnants of Roman infrastructure, but they gradually disappeared due to church influence, disease fears, and general decline. When bathing did happen, it was often in cold water, shared with others, and reused. Soap was expensive. Water had to be carried in buckets and heated by fire. For most, it wasn't worth the effort. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were everywhere. Delousing combs were common household items. If your hair was only mildly infested, you were considered clean. Bedding was rarely washed. Clothes were worn until they rotted. Most people owned two outfits, one for everyday labor, and one for holy days. Shoes were thin leather or cloth, offering little protection. Yet despite the filth, people still worked relentlessly. Every day began at sunrise. For farmers, which was the majority, this meant heading to the fields with wooden tools, often barefoot or in worn shoes. Oxen pulled plows. Children worked alongside parents. There were no weekends, no vacations, only feast days dictated by the church, which, ironically, were often filled with religious obligations. Harvest season was the most grueling time of all. When crops were ready, there was no choice but to work from dawn until nightfall, sometimes 16 hours a day. Every able body was required, men, women, children, and the elderly all had roles to play. The timing was crucial. A storm could destroy an entire year's labor. Every hour mattered. Food for the winter depended on it. The tools were simple: scythes, sickles, wooden forks. There were no machines. No horses pulling threshers. Just hands, backs, and unyielding determination. Fields had to be cut, grain bundled, dried, threshed, and stored, all while racing the clock. Blisters formed, then bled. Hands cracked open. Yet no one stopped. To stop was to risk starvation. Even outside the harvest, daily work never truly ended. Livestock needed feeding. Fences needed mending. Firewood had to be chopped. Water had to be hauled from wells or rivers. Bread had to be baked, often by the women, who also spun thread, wove cloth, and tended to children. There was no concept of gender equality, but neither was there much rest. Labor was survival. If you weren't a farmer, your options weren't much better. Tradesmen and craftsmen worked in grim, dangerous conditions. Blacksmiths stood in front of open forges, inhaling smoke and metal fumes. Burns were common. Eyesight failed early. Tanners, who processed animal hides, worked in vats of urine, dog feces, and lime, their hands constantly soaked in corrosive chemicals. They stank so badly they were often forced to live on the edge of town. To become skilled in a craft, one began as an apprentice, usually at age 7. Parents would send their children to live with a master, who would house, feed, and train them, often in exchange for years of unpaid labor. Apprentices cleaned, fetched, learned by watching, and endured long hours of hard work. It could take 7 to 14 years before they were considered good enough to earn a wage. Some children didn't apprentice. They worked. Many helped in fields or became servants. Others joined the most desperate of professions. Link boys, for instance, carried torches for the wealthy at night, guiding them through dark streets in exchange for coins. Chimney sweeps, often young boys, crawled through narrow soot-choked shafts, risking suffocation. In cities, orphans and poor children scavenged or stole. There were few safety nets. And through all this, sickness lingered constantly in the background. The common cold could turn fatal. Infections from a minor cut might lead to sepsis. A toothache could become a death sentence. There were no antibiotics. No germ theory. People didn't understand bacteria. They believed illness came from bad air, or imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, guided nearly all treatments. If someone was feverish, it was believed their blood was too hot. The cure: bloodletting. A physician or barber surgeon would slice open a vein and drain blood into a bowl. Sometimes leeches were used, dozens at a time, to suck out the bad blood. These treatments often weakened the patient further, hastening death. Physicians were rare, expensive, and not always helpful. Many relied on astrology or superstition. More often, people sought help from local herbalists, midwives, or priests. Folk remedies ranged from harmless, like elderflower tea or honey, to lethal, such as mercury, arsenic, or ground lead. Child mortality was heartbreakingly high. 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Many never made it past infancy. Disease, poor nutrition, accidents, or childbirth complications claimed lives constantly. Mothers often gave birth at home, assisted by midwives. There were no sterilized instruments. No anesthetics. If complications arose, both mother and child might die. The average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years, though this figure is skewed by high infant mortality. Those who survived childhood might live into their 50s or 60s, but old age was rare. A 50-year-old laborer was considered ancient. Wrinkles, missing teeth, bad joints, and hunched backs were signs not just of aging, but of a body used to its limits. Plagues swept through Europe repeatedly. The most infamous, the Black Death of the 14th century, killed an estimated 50% of the population. Entire villages were wiped out. People didn't know what caused it. Some blamed sin. Others blamed foreigners, cats, witches, or bad stars. Some believed it was punishment from God. Doctors wore long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to ward off disease. It didn't help. The death toll was staggering. Hygiene, or the lack of it, contributed to the spread of disease. Most people bathed only a few times a year. In cold months, they might not wash at all. Water had to be heated and carried. Soap was expensive. And the idea of invisible contagion didn't exist. People wore the same clothes for weeks or months. Underclothes were rarely washed. Outer garments were brushed or beaten clean. Bed linens were seldom changed. Fleas and lice were constant companions. People scratched openly. Lice combs were passed around. Flea bites were expected. The idea of being fully clean was not only impractical, it was unfamiliar. Still, there were attempts at cleanliness. Wealthier individuals might bathe more often, especially in southern Europe where Roman traditions lingered longer. Communal bathhouses existed in some cities, but over time, concerns about morality and disease caused their decline. By the late medieval period, many had closed altogether. Clothing was basic. Most people owned 2 outfits, one for daily work, one for church. Fabric was homespun, often wool or linen. Dyes were expensive, so clothing was mostly dull brown, gray, or off-white. Bright colors signaled wealth. Shoes were thin leather or fabric, offering little insulation. In winter, people wrapped their feet in straw. There were no waterproof boots. No insulation. Just grit, leather, and endurance. Shelter offered little relief. The average peasant lived in a one-room home made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered in mud and straw. The roof was thatched. The floor was dirt. In some homes, animals shared the space. Goats, pigs, or chickens lived indoors for warmth and protection. The fire burned constantly, but there was no chimney, smoke drifted through the roof or hung in the air. There was no privacy. Families slept together, sometimes several to a bed. Curtains or partitions were rare. Intimacy, modesty, and personal space were luxuries. Even in wealthier households, servants were often present at all hours. A nobleman's bedroom might also be his office, his dining area, and a waiting room. Solitude was nearly impossible. Despite this, people found ways to live. They laughed, gossiped, fell in love, and raised families. They celebrated feast days with dancing and games. They marked seasons with festivals, planting in spring, harvest in fall, Yule in winter. Life was hard, but not without moments of joy. Entertainment, when it came, was loud and communal. Storytellers, minstrels, and jugglers performed in town squares. Traveling players staged morality plays, dramatizations of Christian virtues. Church services were the center of community life. Holidays like Easter and Christmas brought music, food, and a brief respite from toil. But much of medieval entertainment was brutal. Public executions were major events. People gathered in the thousands to watch criminals hanged, burned, or drawn and quartered. Heads were displayed on city gates. Thieves had hands cut off. Traitors were disemboweled. Justice was public and performative. Animal fights were common. Bear baiting, dog fights, and cockfights drew crowds. Markets buzzed with noise, sellers shouting, musicians playing, beggars asking for coins. Festivals often included drinking, gambling, and contests of strength or skill. These were not polite affairs. They were rowdy, crowded, and full of life. Religious belief permeated every aspect of existence. The church dictated behavior, morals, holidays, and law. It owned vast land, collected taxes, and enforced orthodoxy. Most people were illiterate. They learned doctrine through sermons, images, and rituals. Churches were often the only stone buildings in a village, towering symbols of power. People believed the world was a battle between good and evil. Heaven and hell were real. Demons, angels, and miracles were accepted as fact. Superstitions filled the gaps where knowledge failed. A solar eclipse could cause panic. A failed harvest might be blamed on witches. Illness might be caused by sin. Saints were prayed to for protection. Relics were thought to heal the sick. Every church claimed a splinter of the true cross, a bone of a saint, or a vial of holy blood. Witchcraft, though not yet the mass hysteria of later centuries, was still feared. Old women, herbalists, or anyone who seemed strange could be accused. Curses, evil eyes, and hexes were taken seriously. The line between faith and fear was often thin. News traveled slowly. Most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Messages moved by foot or horseback. Rumors spread faster than facts. Wars might rage for years without peasants ever knowing who fought or why. Education was limited to the clergy and wealthy. Books were rare, handwritten, and expensive. Knowledge was guarded, not shared. Language itself could be a barrier. English, for instance, changed dramatically over the Middle Ages. A 12th century peasant would barely understand a 14th century nobleman. Dialects varied so widely that even villages just a few miles apart might speak differently. Life was full of uncertainty. A single bad harvest, a minor infection, or an unjust accusation could mean death. There were no second chances. No appeals. No comfort beyond what community and faith could provide. And yet, they endured. Through famine, plague, and hardship, they built the foundations of the world we live in. Their resilience, their labor, and their sacrifices made possible the modern comforts we now take for granted. Education in the medieval world was not a universal right, it was a privilege. For most, especially in rural areas, reading and writing were unnecessary. A plowman didn't need to read. A weaver didn't need Latin. Literacy was confined to the clergy, scholars, and the nobility. Even many kings couldn't write their own names. They used seals, wax impressions pressed with a signet ring, to authorize documents. The church controlled nearly all learning. Monasteries were centers of knowledge, preserving ancient texts and training scribes. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, a process so time-consuming that a single Bible might take years to complete. Parchment, made from animal skin, was expensive, and ink was made from iron gall or crushed minerals. Every letter had value. In urban areas, cathedral schools taught the sons of wealthy merchants and officials. The curriculum focused on the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and later, the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. All instruction was in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. Girls were rarely educated beyond what they learned at home, unless they entered a convent. Universities began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, but they were exclusive, male-only institutions. Entry required fluency in Latin and money for tuition and books. Students studied philosophy, theology, law, and medicine. Degrees could take a decade to earn. The goal was not practical knowledge, but religious and philosophical mastery. The most respected profession was the priesthood. For everyone else, knowledge came through oral tradition. Elders told stories, passed down customs, and explained the world through metaphor and faith. People learned by doing, apprenticing, observing, imitating. A child born into a shoemaker's family would become a shoemaker. A blacksmith's son would grow up beside the forge. Life was inherited, not invented. Gender roles were strict and rarely questioned. Men worked outside, women managed the home, though in reality, both contributed to survival. Women helped with planting, harvesting, and caring for animals. They fetched water, spun thread, wove cloth, and made food from scratch. Many ran small businesses, sold produce at markets, or worked as midwives or healers. Marriage was a practical arrangement. Among peasants, love was a bonus, not a requirement. Marriages were often arranged by parents to secure alliances, property, or social status. The church required consent, but in practice, many unions were informal. A promise made in front of witnesses, or even just shared living and children, could constitute marriage in the eyes of the community. Weddings were communal affairs, loud, festive, and followed by days of feasting and drinking, if food allowed. The newly married often moved into a family home, living with parents, siblings, and grandparents under one roof. Privacy was minimal. Domestic life was crowded, noisy, and collaborative. Children were valued, but not romanticized. High mortality meant families had many children, hoping a few would survive to adulthood. Infants were baptized quickly to ensure salvation in case of early death. Childhood, as we understand it, was short. By the age of 7, children were expected to contribute, tending animals, fetching firewood, learning a trade. Toys existed, often handmade, but leisure was rare. Punishment for misbehavior was harsh, even for children. The idea of childhood innocence was not widespread. Children were seen as small adults, expected to obey and work. In noble families, boys were sent to train as pages or squires, while girls were taught to manage households or prepared for strategic marriages. A child's future was determined early and rarely questioned. Despite all this, childhood had its moments of joy. Festivals offered time to play. Songs and rhymes were passed from mouth to mouth. Some children played games with sticks and hoops or carved wooden dolls. In towns, they watched acrobats or animals at fairs. These brief escapes provided relief from routine. But danger was never far. Accidents, disease, and famine claimed young lives constantly. For mothers, childbirth remained one of the most dangerous events. There were no hospitals, no cesareans, no pain relief beyond herbs and prayers. If complications arose, there was little anyone could do. Women died in alarming numbers. A widow might remarry within weeks, not from coldness, but from necessity. A household could not run itself. Death was omnipresent. Cemeteries were central to community life. Churchyards were full. Graves were shallow. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, not coffins, unless the deceased was wealthy. Funerals were simple. Bells tolled. Prayers were said. Life went on. People feared hell more than death. The church taught that sin could condemn a soul to eternal torment. Purgatory was a halfway place, a spiritual waiting room where souls were cleansed by suffering. The living could help the dead by praying, giving alms, or paying for masses to be said. A good Christian life, attending church, confessing sins, obeying the clergy, was the best hope of salvation. This belief shaped daily actions. People feared excommunication, being cut off from the sacraments and community. They obeyed feast days, fasted, and followed the liturgical calendar. Saints were venerated as protectors. Pilgrimages were undertaken to visit holy relics. The church offered meaning, structure, and answers in a world full of uncertainty. But belief also bred fear. Superstition filled the gaps left by ignorance. A bad crop might be blamed on a curse. Illness could be the work of an evil eye. Strange weather, animal behavior, or dreams might carry hidden messages. Folk healers used charms, prayers, and rituals alongside herbs. Magic and faith blurred. The line between priest and sorcerer was not always clear. Witchcraft accusations, while not yet at their peak, existed. A widow who lived alone, a healer who failed to cure, a woman who spoke too freely, all were at risk. Conflicts, jealousy, or misfortune could spark suspicion. Trials were crude. Confessions extracted under torture were common. Punishment ranged from public penance to execution. Crime was handled locally. Villages had constables or reeves who enforced order. There were no police. Communities policed themselves. Accusations led to trials by ordeal, carrying hot iron, plunging a hand into boiling water, the wounds inspected for divine judgment. Later, trial by jury replaced this, but justice remained harsh. Theft, assault, and rebellion were met with swift punishment. Stocks and pillories humiliated offenders. Branding marked criminals permanently. Hanging was common. Nobles might be beheaded. Heretics were burned. Punishment was meant to be public, painful, and memorable. Fear maintained order. Yet crime persisted. In cities, cut purses and pickpockets worked the crowds. In the countryside, bandits preyed on travelers. Roads were dangerous. Merchants hired guards. Inns offered rest, but also risk. A stranger could be a thief, a spy, or worse. Life within towns offered opportunity but also crowding and chaos. Streets were narrow, muddy, and jammed with people, carts, animals, and refuse. Vendors shouted. Children ran. Smells of cooking, tanning, and sewage mingled in the air. Pigs roamed freely. Fires were a constant threat. One spark could destroy an entire district. Markets were the heartbeat of towns. Everything from wool to wine, spices to shoes, was bought and sold. Bargaining was expected. Guilds regulated trades, ensuring quality, protecting members, and training apprentices. Competition was fierce. Reputation mattered. Towns also brought culture. Cathedrals towered over rooftops, symbols of spiritual and civic pride. Bells rang daily. Music, processions, and festivals filled the calendar. Mystery plays reenacted biblical stories. Poets and troubadours sang of love and loss. Learning, art, and innovation began to stir. By the late Middle Ages, change was coming. The plague had reduced populations, shifting labor power. Serfs demanded wages. Some won freedom. Towns grew richer. Commerce expanded. The printing press was on the horizon. Ideas began to spread faster than ever before. But for centuries, life remained brutally hard for the majority. They bore hunger, cold, disease, injustice, and fear with a strength we can scarcely imagine. They lived with few comforts, little privacy, and constant toil, yet they endured. They built cathedrals that touched the sky. They carved fields from forests. They passed on songs, customs, stories, traces of themselves that still echo in our lives. We owe them more than we realize. The modern world, with its medicine, knowledge, and abundance, is not the norm. It is the result of generations who suffered and struggled and dreamed of something better. Every warm bed, every clean glass of water, every trip to a well-stocked grocery store is a privilege built on their pain. We complain when the power goes out for an hour. But they lived without it entirely. We shiver when the heating fails for a day. They endured winters with no insulation, no hot showers, no thick coats. We grumble about long workdays. They worked from sunrise to sunset, every day, with no promise of rest, reward, or retirement. To understand medieval life is not to romanticize it. It is to respect it. To recognize that hardship was the rule, not the exception. That survival was a daily triumph. And that everything we take for granted today, literacy, health, sanitation, freedom, was won by people who never lived to enjoy it. We stand on their bones. We speak their language. We sleep safely in homes whose foundations were laid with hands that trembled from hunger. This was their world. Brutal, beautiful, unforgiving, and very, very real. Most people today can't imagine a life where darkness rules half the day, not metaphorically, but literally. In the medieval world, when the sun went down, the world changed. Without electric lights, candles or torches were the only illumination, and both were expensive. A single beeswax candle might cost more than a peasant earned in a week. Most families relied on rushlights, thin sticks of dried rush dipped in animal fat, which burned dimly and quickly, filling rooms with smoke and stink. So people planned their lives around the sun. They rose at dawn, worked through the light, and huddled near the hearth after dark. There was no staying up late to read or relax. The fire provided light, warmth, and comfort, but wood had to be chopped, dried, and stored, and in some regions it was scarce. Poor families rationed firewood like food. In cold seasons, some rooms stayed unheated. People wore their coats to bed. Children slept side by side for warmth. At night, the streets were dangerous. There were no street lamps, no police. Thieves and drunks prowled. Animals howled in the distance. In towns, gates were locked at nightfall. Traveling after dark was a gamble, and one many avoided. Stories of highwaymen, witches, or wolves kept people close to home. And there was something else too, the fear of the unknown. In a world without science, the night was a place where demons walked, where the dead whispered, and where prayers were said a little more fervently. But even during daylight, the medieval world could be unpredictable. Weather ruled everything. A summer hailstorm could destroy an entire harvest. A cold spring could kill seedlings. A single year of crop failure meant hunger. 2 years in a row meant famine. People had no reserves, no national aid. They relied on each other. Entire communities might slowly starve, not from lack of work, but from bad luck. Famine was a constant threat. In the 14th century, the Great Famine swept across Europe. Crops failed for multiple years in a row. Grain stores were empty. People ate bark, grass, cats, dogs, even the dead. Parents abandoned children. Children were sold or left to die. Cannibalism, while rare, was whispered about. The famine killed millions. But it was only one of many. Droughts, floods, infestations, they all carried the power to starve entire regions. When hunger didn't kill, war often did. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and territories constantly shifting through conflict. Lords raised armies. Kings fought over land, titles, and thrones. Peasants paid the price. They were conscripted, taxed, or caught in the crossfire. Fields were trampled. Villages burned. Livestock stolen. And when soldiers came, friend or foe, they took what they needed. For nobles, war was both business and honor. Knights trained from boyhood in the art of combat. They served lords, fought in armor, and were bound by the ideals of chivalry, though in practice, chivalry often meant little on a muddy battlefield. Armor was heavy, expensive, and required servants to maintain. Battles were brutal. Swords, maces, axes, longbows, these were not clean weapons. Limbs were severed. Skulls crushed. Guts spilled. There were no field medics. No antibiotics. A wound could mean weeks of agony before death. Sieges were even worse. A castle under siege became a prison. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread. Wells were poisoned. Corpses were catapulted over walls. Defenders might last months, even years, but in the end, many fell. When they did, the consequences were often horrifying. Looting. Murder. Rape. Even churches were not always spared. The church itself waged war, too. Crusades called upon knights and kings to take up arms in the name of God, whether in the Holy Land, against heretics in Europe, or to suppress internal rebellion. These holy wars were sold as salvation, sins forgiven for those who took the cross, but they left trails of death and destruction in their wake. Thousands marched across continents. Many died of disease, starvation, or desert heat before ever meeting the enemy. Back home, the church's power reached into every life. It collected tithes, a tenth of one's income, enforced moral codes, and owned vast lands. It could crown or depose kings. It ran courts that tried people for heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft. Inquisitions began rooting out perceived threats to doctrine. Even a whispered doubt could draw suspicion. Books were banned. Scholars silenced. Fear, once again, was the tool of control. Yet within monasteries and convents, quiet revolutions brewed. Monks copied not only religious texts, but ancient works of philosophy, science, and medicine. Islamic scholars had preserved many Greek and Roman ideas, and slowly, through Spain and Sicily, those ideas returned to Europe. Astronomy, mathematics, and early chemistry crept into the shadows of monastic libraries. Curiosity stirred. In cities like Florence and Paris, intellectual movements began to flicker. Scholars questioned Aristotle. Writers explored human nature. Artists studied anatomy. These seeds would later bloom into the Renaissance, but in the medieval period, they grew slowly, cautiously, always under the watchful eye of the Church. Art, too, was beginning to change. At first, it was flat, symbolic, purely religious, halos and icons, with no attempt at realism. But over time, it evolved. Illuminated manuscripts dazzled with color and gold leaf. Cathedrals reached higher, filled with stained glass windows that bathed stone in light and color. Gargoyles leered down from rooftops, both decoration and warning. Sculptures began to show emotion. Painters toyed with perspective. Creativity was stirring beneath the surface of fear. Music filled the air, especially in churches. Gregorian chants echoed through stone halls, voices in unison, rising and falling like breath. Minstrels carried songs from town to town, blending languages and traditions. Instruments like the lute, harp, and pipe brought melody to taverns and courts. People danced, clapped, drank, and sang. Music was one of the few universal pleasures, accessible even to the poor. And amid all the struggle, people still dreamed. Dreamed of safety. Of prosperity. Of God. Of love. Stories were told by firelight, tales of knights and dragons, saints and miracles, tragic lovers and clever peasants who outwitted the rich. Oral tradition carried these tales through generations. They weren't just entertainment, they were maps of the soul. They taught values, warned of danger, offered hope. Hope was precious. Because for all its hardship, medieval life was not without beauty. A sunrise over dewy fields. The laughter of children chasing chickens. The sound of bells calling villagers to mass. The hush of snowfall over a thatched roof. The scent of fresh bread, rare as it was. A wedding. A birth. A good harvest. A warm fire. These things mattered. Community was survival. Neighbors helped raise children, repair roofs, share grain. The bond of village life was deep. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets were few. Gossip traveled fast. There was little room for isolation. In this way, the medieval world was both claustrophobic and intimate. You were never alone, for better or worse. But time moved slowly. Days dragged in repetition. Years blurred into one another. The calendar was marked not by numbers, but by saints' days and harvests. People didn't celebrate birthdays. They marked life by events, the year of the Great Fire, the winter the river froze, the time the plague came. Memory was collective. Personal history intertwined with communal survival. And through it all, the seasons ruled. Spring meant planting, hope and backbreaking work. Summer was growth, vigilance against pests, prayers for rain or sun. Autumn was harvest, exhausting and urgent. Winter was rest, if you could call it that, long, dark, cold, and hungry. Each season brought its own rhythm, its own dangers, its own fragile gifts. When we look back at the medieval world, it is easy to focus only on the suffering. And indeed, there was plenty. Disease, war, ignorance, hunger, these were constants. But that is not the whole story. There was love, laughter, learning, art. There was resilience in the face of misery. There was dignity in daily labor. There was wisdom passed not through books, but through hands and mouths and memories. The people of the Middle Ages lived with little, but they lived. They bore pain without modern medicine. They worked without machines. They endured loss without therapy. And somehow, they still managed to build, to sing, to raise children, and to hope. Their world was not ours. But it shaped ours. Their roads became our highways. Their words became our language. Their fears became our stories. And their struggles, forgotten by most, made our comforts possible. So the next time you complain about a slow phone, a long day, or a broken air conditioner, remember this: you wouldn't last a day in the world they called home. And they, somehow, lasted lifetimes. As the medieval centuries wore on, small signs of change began to appear, not in sudden revolutions, but in quiet, stubborn shifts. Populations slowly rebounded from famine and plague. Trade routes expanded. Markets grew busier. Skilled labor became more valuable. Towns began to challenge the authority of distant lords. People who had once been bound to land started moving, first in secret, then in numbers too large to ignore. Serfdom, that age-old system of inherited servitude, began to crack. Lords found themselves negotiating with workers instead of commanding them. Labor shortages gave peasants leverage, and in some places, wages rose. The rigid class structures didn't vanish, but they started to bend. The idea that a person might improve their station in life no longer seemed entirely impossible. Not likely, but not laughable either. Still, society remained deeply unequal. Nobles controlled the land, the law, and the armies. The church controlled belief, behavior, and knowledge. Most people remained peasants, tied to survival, tradition, and God. But whispers of new thinking were spreading. In city workshops, in monastery scriptoriums, in traveling merchants' tales, ideas were on the move. The invention of the mechanical clock was one such shift. Before clocks, time was measured in sunrises, bells, and seasons. Now, hours could be counted, divided, scheduled. Time became a resource, not just a rhythm. And with that change came the slow birth of something we now take for granted, the sense of a future. A plan. A schedule. A life not entirely ruled by chance. Then came the printing press. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type to Europe. Books that once took monks years to copy could now be printed in weeks. Information no longer lived solely in the hands of priests and nobles. Literacy began to rise. Ideas, once locked in monasteries, poured into cities, homes, and minds. The Reformation, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, none would have been possible without it. But that was still to come. For most of the medieval world, change came slowly, too slowly to feel. Generations lived and died farming the same fields, speaking the same dialect, fearing the same sickness, bowing before the same altar. That was their world. A world of scarcity and faith, of brutality and beauty, of endurance without choice. So what did it mean to live then? It meant waking up in the cold and putting your feet on a dirt floor. It meant scratching lice from your scalp and hoping there'd be enough food to last the day. It meant watching a child cough and wondering if they'd still be breathing by nightfall. It meant working until your hands bled and still owing more to your Lord. It meant fearing the sky when it darkened, the wind when it shifted, the stranger when he knocked. It meant living in a world where you didn't ask why things were the way they were, because the answer was always the same: God willed it. And yet, it also meant knowing every star in the sky and every herb in the field. It meant hearing music echo off stone walls and watching candlelight flicker on your child's face. It meant laughter during a harvest feast, warmth from a shared blanket, pride in a well-made boot or a perfectly baked loaf. It meant community, not the digital kind, but the kind built from leaning on others, from borrowed tools and shared grief. People were not ignorant, they were practical. They weren't emotionless, they just had no space for sentimentality. When death is daily, you learn not to cry at every passing. You save your tears for the rare miracle of survival. The medieval mind saw the world as a divine order: stars in the heavens, kings on their thrones, peasants in their fields, all according to plan. But beneath that rigid order was a pulse of curiosity, creativity, and rebellion that never fully died. It lived in songs, in carvings, in whispered questions, in the refusal to give up, despite everything. Even their faith, so often portrayed as oppressive, was more complex than fear and obedience. It was also comfort. In a world without safety nets, God was the net. Heaven was the hope. Saints were allies. Angels were guardians. The Virgin Mary was a mother to the motherless. The church could be cruel, but belief could be kind. There were moments of true peace. A baby sleeping through the night. The scent of rain on dry earth. The first green shoots of spring after a brutal winter. The silence of snowfall on a frozen morning. The sound of a familiar voice calling your name in the fields. These were the things that made life bearable, not luxury, not wealth, but the small, persistent reminders that something beautiful could still exist. And perhaps that's the greatest myth we tell ourselves about the past, that it was all suffering. It wasn't. It was struggle, yes. But not without joy. Not without love. Not without art and laughter and meaning. The people of the Middle Ages weren't just victims of their time, they were survivors of it. They danced at weddings. They told jokes. They made music with bones and bells and bare hands. They painted saints with gold halos. They stitched stories into tapestries. They dreamed. They dreamed of safety. Of love. Of salvation. Of better. We often look back with a sense of superiority. We say, they were ignorant. They were brutal. They were backwards. But when the lights go out, when systems fail, when modern comforts vanish even for a moment, it is their toughness we envy. Their self-sufficiency. Their ability to endure. And maybe that's the real legacy of the medieval world, not the castles, or cathedrals, or coats of arms, but the deep, stubborn human ability to persist. To wake up in a cold world and still plant seeds. To bury a child and still sing. To live in fear and still find reasons to laugh. To suffer, and still hope. Because hope is not modern. Hope is ancient. Hope is medieval. Hope is what kept them alive, and what brings us here today. So if you think your life is hard, remember this: your morning coffee would have been a miracle. Your warm shower, a dream. Your bed, your medicine, your privacy, your safety, all things they never knew, but would have given everything for. You live in a world they built, brick by brick, breath by breath. You inherited their battles, their stories, their scars. You wouldn't last a single day in their shoes. But they, somehow, lasted lifetimes in theirs.